Okay, so this lesson is all about discovering your strengths. And I'd like to invite you to think for a moment, that question when you go for an interview and it's always in there and the interviewer asks you about your strengths and your weaknesses. And it's one of those questions that everybody hates because usually we can think about some strengths. What we struggle to think about is weaknesses. And I don't really like to think about them as weaknesses. I tend to like to turn that around a little bit and think about what are our areas for development, because if we look at it through that lens, that's helping you to see that actually it's not a weakness, it's just something that we haven't learnt about yet. So I'd like to share a story from when I was my much younger self and I was a very junior nurse, and I invested some time and money in engaging with somebody to help me write my CV. And I was aware that my own CV at that time wasn't very good, but I didn't know how to do it. So I paid my money and I went along, and I think I must have exasperated the person who was trying to help me somewhat because I wasn't very good at articulating what my strengths were. So he gave me literally a pile of words and said, right, take these home, pick out the ones that you think are your strengths, and when you've done that, come back to me. So I did. It took me a week to do. It was one of the most challenging things I'd ever done. But when I kind of look back at that now, it was also one of the best things that I ever did. Why it was difficult for me at that time was because as a junior nurse, I hadn't really had any feedback at that point about how I was going in my career. So it wasn't the case or the norm back then that people would actually give you constructive feedback about how you were doing in your role, which is why I struggle so much, I think, to identify my strengths. But actually going through that exercise helped me going forward into the roles that I'd had, because for one, I was able to answer that interview question, and I was also much more clearer about what my development roles were. What my development needs were. And it also helped me in other ways as a leader, helping to understand the skills of my team. So identifying your strengths is one of the reasons that it's in the foundations of leadership, because once you know and understand your strengths, it helps you to know and understand the strengths in your team. Once you know the strengths within your team, it helps you to delegate and allows your team to grow their skills, because one thing as a new leader people often struggle with is wanting to try and do everything themselves because they worry that things might get missed or not get done properly. But if you remember what we talked about in the previous lessons, part of being a leader is about developing others. So knowing the strengths that you have within your team helps you to be able to delegate roles, and that allows your team to grow and develop their skills. It's also an important exercise because sometimes we don't always know our own blind spots. What do I mean by blind spots? Well, those are the things that we can't always see for ourselves. So they're things that other people who know us really well observe about us. And if we ask them, can often give us good feedback into those parts of ourselves that we might not realise what we're good at, or equally things that maybe we need to learn more about and develop. One of the most common things that my clients bring to coaching is that they don't receive enough feedback in their careers, and that's a struggle, because without feedback we don't grow. We all need feedback, and that's really important because it helps us, it gives us a measure of how we're doing in our role or not. When we don't have that, that's when we start to second guess ourselves and anxiety rises because we don't know how we're doing and we question that within ourselves. So let's return to that part of the question that everybody struggles with, the weaknesses, okay? And if you remember, I talked a little bit about changing the way we think about that from it being a weakness to an area for development. So when you do your strengths exercise, it's also really important to think about where are the areas that you feel you need to spend some time developing, and make a list of those things. So some examples might be, if you're new to a management role, thinking about maybe budget skills or working with the finance team. Do you understand, how to unpick your budget, where you can make savings, those kind of things. There are certain things that people will struggle with, and that's an area that becomes an area for development. Once you're very clear about your development needs, they can be used when you have your appraisal. You can take those forward and say to your manager, these are the areas where I know that I need to grow in to help me in my management or leadership role. And it's a really effective way of, when courses come up, you being able to go back to your manager and say, I've identified this as an area for my growth and development, so I would really like to be considered for this course. So that's a quick strategy, if you like, that can help you to identify your areas for development, think about it differently, so it's not a weakness, it's a development, but also how you can put yourself forward for courses that will support your development in your role. So what I'd like you to do now is to take a little bit of time to reflect, and there's a couple of questions that I would just like you to ask yourself and then sit with whatever comes up for you. Is a little bit like what I call holding up the mirror, and what I mean by that is that we are looking to understand ourselves through the lens of, if you like, looking in a mirror. So the questions that I would like you to ask yourself are, what am I good at? And what do I need to work on, develop and improve? And if you can spend a little bit of time just thinking about those two questions, and then write down the answers on your worksheet. And I'd just also like to add, if you're somebody who perhaps doesn't feel very confident about how to go about identifying your strengths, or you're listening to me thinking, I don't know where to start with this, I don't feel very confident in my role, that's also okay, because one of the things that you can do is choose 3 people that know you really well. So think about your work colleagues, think about family, friends. Pick 3 people who you trust and you know will be honest and give you honest answers, and that you feel safe and comfortable with. And ask them to describe what you're good at in 3 words, and then write those words down. So ask 3 different people the same question to describe what you're good at in 3 words, and then write those down on your worksheet.